I ended up getting the flu when I came home for the holidays, so now before it's too late, I'm finally here to walk y'all through all the books I've read in 2024. Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel. I hope you guys have had a wonderful December and holiday season so far. As you can probably tell by my voice, I got quite sick the last week. I think I came down with the flu after Christmas, which is like classic. But I'm starting to feel better and I'm at that weird point where your voice sounds a lot worse than you're feeling. So bear with me, I'm sorry about this for this video, but I really wanted to talk through these books in time before 2025 starts. And so honestly, I'm just grateful to be here and this cup of tea is gonna help me through the next little bit. I ended up reading 24 books in 2024, which is perfect for the year, but that's actually a pretty slow reading year for me. I would say in general, I always aim to read around 50 books a year and end up reading around 30 to 40. But this past year, I actually graduated from college. And so the first, 6 months, I was working on my thesis and focusing on graduation and spending time with my friends and everything. And so I think I read like 4 books in the first 6 months of 2024. And then I think I caught up and read 20 in the last half, which was really fun. And also just goes to show that like you guys truly don't need an excuse for not reading this year or reading a lot this year, whatever you could do. Just the fact that you were able to read and pick up a book is honestly what's important. So I'm going to be going through those 24 books from worst to best in my opinion. And obviously like huge disclaimer that this is truly my own opinion. You might feel completely differently about these books. So I'd still recommend all of them to you, check them out, give them a chance, see what you think. But obviously my favorites will be reserved for the end of this video. I've written some of my thoughts and lists down in this trusty Lloyd term journal. And so yeah, let's get started. So unfortunately, start with the worst reads end of the spectrum. I would say there are 2 books that were complete flops for me this year. And the first one is Real Life by Brandon Taylor. This book is about Wallace, who is a grad student in the Midwest, as he sort of like comes to terms with his past and also struggles with the isolation that he feels there as a queer Black man in a very predominantly white space. And I was super excited about this one because it had quite good reviews. People seemed to like it. I saw it recommended a couple of times, but I just felt like this was, to be honest, for me, like the worst that MFA writing can produce, which I've seen this so many times in contemporary fiction. I feel like it's sort of like more forced lyrical writing, but with little substance. And in this case, the most frustrating part was that we just never really connected with Wallace. He just came off as very insecure and self-deprecating, but also quite arrogant, but it wasn't done in a sympathetic way because we never got to see sort of a different side of him. And so I felt like there was no sort of like real climax to his character or resolution of conflict. And by the end, I think I was just more annoyed with the main character, which is not a great feeling to have. And then the other book in this flops category is Birds of America by Lori Moore. This is a short story collection. I think that was published in the early 2000s. And all the stories sort of follow like average, sort of suburban like families, couples, and individuals. And it shows the sort of the cracks beneath the surface of their lives. There's a lot of complex relationships, a lot of mistrust, etc. But it's all done in a very sort of like sarcastic, wry humor that at first I was really excited about, and Lori Moore is pretty famous for, and so that's why I sort of picked up the book. And I would say in like the first maybe 1 or 2 stories, it really worked for me. I was really enjoying it, and I thought her style was really cool. And I think most importantly, I felt like the humor had a purpose. It was sort of poking fun at the American dream, at the suburban dream, and these sorts of people that were struggling through it. But then as the collection went on, especially by the latter half, there was still a lot of humor, but I wasn't really getting a lot of it. It was almost too heady, too intellectual, or like too wry. And then the characters were not super relatable or interesting. And I was just kind of like, why are we reading this? Like, what is the point of this story, if that makes sense, for like multiple stories in a row? And so I felt like this was another example of like style cannot save you if the, story is not there, if the character is not there. The next couple of books I have were great in theory, but all sort of had like a fatal flaw. First, we have Jacob's Room by Virginia Woolf, which I believe was her first full-length novel, but it follows the life of a boy named Jacob Flanders who kind of grows up, goes to Cambridge, and ends up getting drafted for the First World War, but it follows his life through sort of like all the characters around him, and especially like his mother and sort of like women who loved him over his lifetime. If you guys are familiar with Virginia Woolf, you'll really recognize that sort of structure and style where she tells the story of someone through sort of like the lives and perspectives of a lot of people around them. But I just felt like this one was a little bit too convoluted. It felt like her techniques and sort of like her genius hadn't really like come together yet, and it was all over the place a little bit. And I think it's still really fun to read if you are a huge Virginia Woolf fan like I am, and you just want to read her canon and understand her as a writer. But otherwise, I don't know if I would necessarily recommend it. I would definitely rather read Mrs. Dalloway or To the Lighthouse or Orlando instead. Next, we have Butter by Asako Yusuki. This was a really recent read for me. I talked about it in my last reading vlog, but this is a book about a journalist named Rika who is investigating the case of a famous female chef who is accused of murdering 3 sort of businessmen. And like I said in my previous video, I thought this was going to be a lot more of like a mystery thriller novel, and it was much more of a sort of character-driven, idea-driven thing about like women, food, and sort of gender norms, and is it a reclamation of power if you use sort of gender norms to your benefit, or is it just conforming to sort of toxic stereotypes? There's a lot more about those questions, and those questions are incredibly cool, but there are 2 fatal flaws of this book. Number 1, I thought it was very long for what it was doing. I think it was kind of going over the same things over and over again, and especially because the feminist commentary at the beginning seemed just a little bit like banal to me, and like kind of like stuff we already know, like kind of basic. Point 2 was that I just felt like the translation was really tripping me up. Again, I can't read the original, so I don't know if the original was also written in sort of like a stilted, strange way, but I just felt like the strangeness of the translation combined with the fact that it was kind of going on and on made it hard for me to like really enjoy the meat of the story. I switched the angle and lift you guys up a bit more, but the next book is A Little Luck by Claudia Pinheiro. If you guys know me, you'll know that Pinheiro has been sort of like my new literary obsession. I'm trying to read as many of her books as I can, and I've read 2 of her books this year, but A Little Luck is sort of on the lower end of my sort of scale this year. This book is about a woman who returns to her home country of Argentina from the US after like 2 decades, and all we know is that she left her son behind, but we're not really sure why. But over the course of the book, it's revealed to us that what happened for her to have to leave her son and sort of the trauma of that incident. And unlike Elena Knows, which is the other Pinheiro book I've read before this, it's not the main character finding out the truth that's the conflict of the novel, it's the reader finding out the truth. And I felt like that was just a little less effective for me. There was not much action, and it was more sort of like past focused than some of her other novels. And even though I think it's important to talk about trauma and I was really interested to see how Pinheiro dealt with it, I just thought it was a little less fun to read, a little bit less engaging, and a slight disappointment for me compared to Pinheiro's other novels, which are so gripping. So yeah, if you're a Pinheiro fan, I'd definitely still read it, but I do think that it's not necessarily one of my favorites of hers. The next book is Chinatown by Tuan. This is a sort of more experimental, lyrical novel told from the perspective of a Vietnamese immigrant woman on the Paris metro with her son. But actually, even though it follows them over a metro ride, most of the book is set in the past with her relationship with her previous husband, and sort of the love that she lost and the grief and the nostalgia, both for Vietnam, the country, but also this specific figure of her husband and her lover. I thought this book was really special. It was very unique, and it spoke about sort of love and yearning and grief in a very honest but beautiful way. And the writing was really exquisite, and the translation was great as well. But I do think it was quite experimental. It's all sort of one big paragraph. The writing style is also very meandering and long and sort of lyrical. And so it took me a while to read, even though the overall effect I thought was pretty powerful. I just meant maybe for me that sort of like more lyrical stream of conscious style has to be done incredibly well. And here I just felt like it was tripping me up a little bit as I was reading it, but I'm still very glad that I got to experience the story. Next, we have quite a few books that I thoroughly enjoyed. They just weren't necessarily in like my top reads of the year, but this is also a very stylistic and personal thing. I think all of these books were really extraordinary, and anyone would probably enjoy them. The first here is The Office of Historical Corrections by Danielle Evans. This is a short story collection that mainly focuses on the stories of young Black women, but through all sorts of different lenses of family, of grief, of a lot of political issues that are very relevant to our contemporary time. But Evans does it in a very sharp, smart, funny way. And even though these are all short stories in a novella, her characters are such fully formed people. I feel like there's a certain sort of humor and sharpness and slight sarcasm that we really like in contemporary literary voices, but oftentimes I think the style, like I mentioned before, can be overdone, but Danielle Evans does it so well. Her style is fully supported by the depth of her characters, the creativeness of her sort of stories. I just think there's a story in here for everyone. It was a quick read, but it got me thinking about a lot of different things, both personally and also politically, and I just think it's quite an important book, so I really enjoyed it. Next, we have The Dark Side of Skin by Jefferson Tenorio. This is a Brazilian novel about a son searching for his murdered father through the items he left behind, as well as his family's history, and it delves into the pervasive racism and police brutality in modern-day Brazil. I thought the writing and translation were really beautiful in this novel, and I love the way the family's history was weaved into sort of like the son figuring out more things about his father, and the characters of the mother and father were extremely well developed and interesting. I just felt like actually, ironically, the son was the least developed, and that was like sort of the one flaw of the book, but I would absolutely recommend it. I think it's also an important read, and I always think it's interesting to see different takes on systematic racism and how it looks different in countries across the world, and so I felt like it was a very good read for this year. The next book is The Earth is Falling by Carmen Pellegrino. This is an Italian book about a town that has been abandoned and sort of the ghosts and spirits that inhabit it, but we aren't really sure if they're ghosts or real people that are inhabiting it, and their stories that interlock with each other. I would say this is quite an experimental piece of writing as well. It feels like sort of like a mood piece that has been stretched out over a book, but it was absolutely great to read in like September, October. Very eerie, kind of ethereal, spooky, and I think especially toward the end had some interesting thoughts about death and what it means to be kept alive by memory. But that being said, there is sort of like a lack of plot or larger meaning outside of like the mood of the piece. So I'd really recommend if you like to like sort of sink yourself into a spooky mood, but not necessarily if you're looking for like a riveting plot and characters. Next, we have Crooked Plow by Itamar Vieira Jr. This is a novel about two sisters who live in a rural region of Brazil where they're mostly subsistence farmers, and they sort of have an accident in their youth that sort of sets them apart, and this follows their coming of age and their divergence, and then they're coming back together again, and the family around them as it changes, and the politics of the region as it changes as well, as the farmers try to retain control of their land in a very sort of like oppressive system. What I loved most about this book was sort of like the magical realism quality to it, the writing. It felt both very fable-esque and yet real at the same time. Like the characters were very believable and you're invested in their well-being and their future, but also sort of like the way that things were told. It felt very dramatic at times. It felt quite refreshing after a lot of literary fiction reads, the contemporary reads. And overall, I thought it was a really beautiful exploration of family, of how we grow up, of what ultimately matters in the end, and of also how politics shapes our daily lives, especially in a region that I did not know about at all before reading this book, and so I would definitely recommend it for the next year. Next, we have Intermezzo by Sally Rooney. In the off chance that you haven't heard about it yet, this is the book about two brothers, Ivan and Peter, who are extremely different and kind of don't get along, but who have just lost their father and now are sort of embarking on their own journeys of grief and also love. It encompasses their changing relationships to each other as well as their lovers and sort of the unconventional forms of love in their lives. In classic Rooney fashion, she sort of captures sort of like the ennui of our generation, but I thought the way that she dealt with grief and also the brothers' differences in this book was really interesting. Her writing was a lot sharper in this one than the other books I've read of hers, and I felt like especially the end was very beautiful and powerful and poignant and sort of brought the whole thing together in a way that made the book a very enjoyable experience for me. Next, we have Toward Eternity by Anton Hur. This is a book about an AI that reaches human levels of intelligence by being taught poetry, which I thought was really beautiful. And sort of the aftermath of that, it covers a huge span of time and goes way into the future and talks about sort of like what AI might become and how it might even replace humanity. But even though on the structural level, this book is sort of like a collection of different characters' perspectives, changing periods of time and occurrences, responding to an evolving technology, questions across the book remain the same. It's really about how language is what makes us human, how art is what makes us human, and how sort of beautiful but also scary that is in a current time like this when AI might be able to learn those things and evolve. And so I'd absolutely recommend it for anyone who loves books, who loves language, who loves literature, but also for anyone who's sort of thinking about the current moment as we face sort of like a huge technological change. It was very inventive but very readable, and I enjoyed it quite a bit. Next is Edinburgh by Alexandra Chi, and before I go into this one, I would just say massive trigger warning for child abuse and sexual assault before you read this book. But this is this coming-of-age story of a boy named Fee and the sexual assault and abuse he experienced and witnessed at his church boys choir when he was younger, and sort of how it affected him and the other boys for the rest of their lives. And it also follows him as an adult and sort of shows the repercussions of childhood trauma. This book was honestly really difficult to read at times. It was very harrowing, but I do think it's a really important read, and it was absolutely beautifully done. I've heard it's largely based on personal experience, and I don't think it feels like it's using trauma to sort of sell the book by any means. It feels like it's a very important exploration of what assault and abuse can do to a child and sort of the repercussions it can have on people's lives, and yet also a beautiful affirmation of life even through that. And the writing is just absolutely exquisite and just really heartbreaking, but also beautiful. And I do think if you can, it's really worth reading at least once in your lifetime. The next book is Martyr by Kaveh Akbar, and this is actually my last read of 2024. I just finished it today. This book is about a main character named Cyrus, who is a poet and a recovering addict and drunk, who is sort of obsessed with the concept of martyrs, particularly because of things that have happened in his family, where he lost both of his mom and dad. And among other things in the book, he sort of seeks out this artist who is dying of cancer, but is doing an exhibit during her last days, talking to people coming into the museum. And so he goes to talk to her about death, about, you know, his sort of fascinations with martyrdom, etc., and feels sort of like this connection with her. But the book also has chapters in the perspectives of both of his parents, as well as sort of like these dream sequences where strange characters come together. And it just sort of all flows together in like this really fluid, interesting way. I liked how it went from sort of like the extremely cerebral and philosophical to like very casual and informal and like, you know, just practical very easily. But the only thing was that there was one plot point that was honestly not very believable for me by the end, and it made the end sort of fall apart, because if you don't believe in the characters and their relationships, it's kind of hard to be sort of touched by the poeticness of the ending and everything, because you're sort of sitting there like, honestly, there's no way this is real. And so I felt like that was very unfortunate. After what felt like a very good read, there was no really satisfying end. Okay, she's back. But the next book is Elena Ferrante's My Brilliant Friend. This is the first of Ferrante's sort of famous Neapolitan novel series, and this was a reread for me this year. I want to say this was my third time reading this now, and I read this at the beginning of this year. But this is the story of two best friends, Elena and Lila, growing up in 1950s Naples and sort of the world around them. And for me, I absolutely understand the popularity of this series. It is such an entrancing world, like it fully sucks you in, and I honestly feel like it has sort of like the intensity and depth and sort of like grandeur of any good like fantasy series, but it's historical fiction and it's sort of like family drama, it's friend drama. It deals a lot with gender, of disparities in education, of class, and of Naples changing over the years as well. And also at the core of it are questions of female friendship, of how intense the love for each other can be, but also the sense of competition. Yeah, I remember I chose this book at the beginning of the year because I was kind of in a reading slump and I wanted something just to completely just fall into. And every time I read this, I totally see why. It's so beautifully written, so well translated, and also just like the story is incredibly gripping and you feel very connected to the characters. And I think this year I decided I didn't necessarily want to read all three. I have read all of them before, but maybe next year I might revisit whenever I need sort of like a reading pick-me-up. And now this is super exciting because we are on to sort of the 6 best books of my year. These books, whether because of the writing, the plot, the characters, or just some personal element that I really loved, were what made my reading year super special, and are books that I hope to keep revisiting and will be recommending to everyone for the next year. I've been having this conversation with some of my friends who are also writers and readers, but I think I realized this year that ultimately what matters to me and what really speaks to me in a work of literature is the author's love for the world and the characters that they are writing. And to me as a reader, I think the difference is so noticeable when a writer really, really loves their characters and their world and their whole story, as opposed to just likes an idea of something or is writing because they feel like they have to write about something. Although I absolutely love literary fiction and classics and works that some people might see as more academic, I do think that ultimately what matters to me is, does it speak to the heart? Does it have a lot of heart in the book? And I'm just really excited about these next 6 books because I do think there's so much love in them. The first, Even has love in the title. It's Difficult Loves by Italo Calvino. This is my first sort of short story collection I read by Calvino other than Invisible Cities, and I read it this past summer. And the stories in this book kind of follow all sorts of different versions of love, romantic, platonic, etc. In these very short sort of wacky stories that feel almost like fairy tales or fables, but that also do have a lot of beautiful moments in them and a lot of truth. And I think Calvino has a way of writing about relationships, about just like very mundane moments that make them seem a little bit more magical, that make you pay a bit more attention. And I really loved that throughout this book. It's also just great light reading if you just want to read a story and put it down before bed or something. I think this is such an easy book to do that with, and I would absolutely recommend it for 2025. This book really convinced me to read more Calvino next year, so hopefully I'll be able to rec some more of his books next year as well. Next we have Go Tell on the Mountain by James Baldwin. Baldwin is, of course, one of my favorite writers of all time, and this is the first novel that he ever wrote. It's about a young boy named Johnny who is sort of destined to become a preacher like his father, but has a very complicated relationship with his family and the church, and it follows his sort of reconciliation with that, as well as delves into the perspectives of his father, his mother, and his aunt, showing their sort of stories and how they got to Harlem in the 20s from the South. I just think very few people write about family and community and just life like Baldwin. His writing is absolutely beautiful, and his characters are very fully fleshed. They're like completely grounded in this place that he loves and in these stories that he is obviously very passionate about. Even though they're honestly all very flawed, it makes the reader care so much for these characters and root for them and just be so equally invested in their lives, which I think is really special when you're reading a book. This one in particular is quite spiritual, and as someone who has very little religious connections, I was struggling with that a little bit, but I do think it's also something really beautiful, and you kind of get into the rhythm of it and you can really tell how important this was to Baldwin, and I thought that was really interesting element of this book as well. I forgot to say it, but Go Tell on the Mountain was also a reread for the first time in 7 years since I was in high school. And we have another reread on my top 6 books of the year list, which is Sula by Toni Morrison, another one of my favorite writers. And this book is also about two best friends, Nell and Sula, and it follows them from their youth to growing up, getting married, having families, etc. But they follow extremely different paths. Nell kind of goes a very conventional path, and Sula is sort of, as Toni Morrison said, apparently, a woman who is available to her own imagination, which I thought was really beautiful. Basically, she's a very wild sort of soul. It goes against sort of all the conventions of what is expected of a black woman at this time. But this puts a huge rift in their relationship, and Sula does something to completely betray Nell's friendship and trust. And by the end, it's a very interesting story of the complicatedness of female friendship, like I mentioned with My Brilliant Friend, and the different paths that women take under the same expectations of femininity and gender roles at this time. In particular, I really love the dialogue in this. It's so honest to how women talk to each other, and it's so fun to read. You get very like wrapped up in their conversations. But what I especially loved about this book is that you feel both for Nell and Sula. You see them struggling to kind of be themselves in a system that is very restricted. And I think Sula has such an interesting imagination of what happens when a woman just sort of decides not to, conform to what people tell her to do, but also sort of like the havoc and destruction that can wreak on her personal relationships and her friendship. Next we have Songs on Endless Repeat by Anthony Viesneso, and this is sort of a strange addition because in a way this is an incomplete book. It's a collection of Anthony Viesneso's essays and then also his unfinished novel manuscript, a couple chapters from it that they've compiled into sort of one last book from this writer who, if you guys don't know, passed away at a very early age a couple of years ago. He's the author of After Parties, which is a short story collection that is one of my favorite books of all time. And sort of to say one extra thing about it is what I think is sort of like one of the best works of Asian American literature of our time. And yeah, that book made me a huge fan of Anthony Viesneso, and I was really sad to learn that there wasn't any other writing that we can read. And then this one came out this year, and actually, even though the essays in it are complete, what is much more interesting to me and why this book has made it into the top list is actually the incomplete fiction, the sort of novel excerpts that he's left behind. I think his fiction is absolutely extraordinary. Even in the excerpts that we get, it is just so alive. Like the energy he writes with is unlike any other writer I've ever read. The characters are so believable, so funny, and their relationships are so interesting. And they feel so real to me that I feel like they might just pop out of like my world. And I'm just so glad I found this book because now I have After Parties and this one to continue revisiting for the rest of my life. to make sure that I have Anthony Biasnesso's work with me for the rest of my life, because he is truly one of my favorite writers, and this is all the writing we have of his in the world right now. So yeah, I would absolutely recommend this one, but definitely after you've read After Parties. Next is a book I've talked about super recently on this channel in my last reading vlog, which is Time of the Flies by Claudia Pinheiro. Feel free to go check that out to see my whole reading process and like my full reactions. But this is a book about Inez, a woman who went to prison for killing her husband's ex-lover and then left prison and now runs like sort of like an insect pest removal service, but gets a request by sort of like this rich woman in the neighborhood to sell her poison so that she can also kill her husband's lover. But at a certain point in the book, we're not sure if that's exactly why she wants the poison, and it starts this very sort of thrilling, suspenseful couple of days and brings up questions of accountability and choice and what we're allowed to choose, and how much responsibility we should take for those choices. In classic Pinheiro fashion, there's really beautiful writing and sort of reflections on life, but most of it is supported by like this plot that you cannot stop reading, which I love. And like Alana Knows, which was my favorite book 2 years ago in 2022, this book just sort of blew me off my feet. I had no idea where it was going, and by the end I was completely hooked. I also felt like I'd taken a very emotional deep dive into these characters and sort of them finding meaning in their lives even after having gone through a lot of hardship. This combination of unforgettable characters and just sort of like an not put downable plot is why I absolutely love Claudia Pinheiro and why this book was one of my favorites of the year. And last but not least, we have Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf, which is officially my favorite book of 2024. And this is cheating a little bit because this is probably one of my favorite books, if not my favorite book of all time. This is a book about Mrs. Dalloway, a woman in her 50s who is off to set up a party, and it follows her throughout the course of a day, but it skips around a ton into the perspectives of different people that she interacts with, and kind of goes into her past, goes into her current marriage and family, as well as her past relationships and who she was as a younger woman, and then culminates in sort of like this party that she throws at the end, and sort of skips around all these different people who know her and paints a picture of who she is in the minds of all these other people. This was also a reread for me. This is my third time reading Mrs. Dalloway, and I'm just blown away by it every single time. Although a lot of the reason I love it is the energy of the writing, just sort of like the intensity of it, and sort of also kind of like the wackiness of it. It can feel a little hard to get into at times, but once you get into the rhythm, it's like you're completely absorbed in this world. But what I love most about it is that to me it feels like sort of philosophical work about who we are as people at the end of the day. It seems to me like what it's saying is that who we are is truly defined by our relationships to other people, and how fundamentally unknowable we are, but also how that's the best we can do, how all we can try is to give as much of ourselves to each other as possible and see each other as much as possible, and at the end of the day that is what we leave of ourselves in this world. And yeah, I could honestly talk about this book for days and days. I've written papers about it in college. I absolutely adore it so much, and I think it's a book that I will revisit for every couple of years for the rest of my life. So like I said, while it's a little bit of a cheat for me, this is my favorite book of the year, and I hope that you get a chance to read it once in your lifetime. And lastly, I just wanted to end by mentioning that there are 3 exceptions to sort of this list. 2 of them are Korean books, which I might cover separately in a short, so you guys can look out for that I'll hopefully try to do in both English and Korean. And then one of them is Indeterminate in Fluorescence by Lee Song-bok, translated by Anton Her. And the reason this isn't in my list is the only piece of work that's not fiction that I read. This was a book of sort of like axioms and sayings about poetry from one of Korea's greatest poets that are really beautiful and very inspiring when it comes to thinking about words, creativity, and art. But yeah, I just felt like it was a special category, so I wanted to give it a little shout out. And with that, that concludes all the books that I've read for 2024. It was such a fun reading year. I think I ended up reading a lot of new books, and I think I also read about 9 books in translation, which I'm really proud of. And hopefully that number will only go up next year. I'll be back soon with a yearly favorites video that's not book related, and then in the next video I'll be talking about some of my goals for the year, including bookish goals, so keep your eyes out for that. Fingers crossed that my voice gets better soon. Otherwise, Happy New Year, and thank you guys so much for all your support in 2024. It has been such a special year on this channel, and I feel so grateful for all the love every single day. Hopefully I will be able to bring you guys all the great content in the new year, and I can't wait to see what we read and get up to in 2025. Thanks so much for watching. Subscribe if you haven't, and I will see you soon. Bye!